young people, and this is a phrase, right, and you could define, right, are increasingly becoming disenfranchised by religion. So what does that mean to you, and why do you think it's happening?
Yeah, I think it's the idea that people are becoming more and more jaded with religion or deconstructing their faith. Why is it happening? I think the first group I would talk to is pastors and ministry leaders, because the way that the question is framed, it's sort of geared towards them. But what I would say is when people grow disenfranchised or jaded with religion, it's not something that's new. So you actually see, a lot of people in the Bible becoming jaded or deconstructing their faith as well. So it's not something that's new, but it is something that's more visible than it was ever before. So hence, books on deconstruction, podcasts on deconstruction, courses on how to deconstruct your faith even. And so there are now more communities with deconstructed folks that are gathering and assembling together. So it's not new, but it is more visible. And so how do we speak into the lives of those that are thinking about potentially, abandoning their faith? So go ahead.
What do you think is often the impetus for that deconstructionist journey?
Yeah, so usually when you take a look at the people that are thinking about abandoning their faith, it's usually people that grew up in the church, not people that are like brand new to the faith, obviously. So it's usually people that grew up in the church, and probably the easiest way to think about it is the head, the heart, and the hands. So in our church, for example, there are a ton of people that left the church and then for whatever reason they came back. And so usually when they do come back or they're thinking about leaving, there are head questions, right? So one of the things that we say ad nauseum is that if you have these doubts, it's not a bad thing, it's actually a good thing. So we say doubt is not the opposite of belief, unbelief is the opposite of belief. Doubts are somewhere in the middle, and if you find answers for your doubts, it can actually propel you to have stronger faith. If you don't find those answers, it'll propel you to unbelief. So doubts can actually be a strong thing, but are they finding the answers? And more often than not, if you grew up in the church and you sort of have an inherited faith, it's not really your own. And so you just were told to go to church, you were told to believe, but you never found answers to, what about this and what about that? So sometimes there are head issues, and they didn't find the answers to that, and we want to help with that. So we say doubts are good, and we want to affirm the doubts that they have in a way where we can help them find answers. Then there's heart issues, and so we've all heard the expression, the heart wants what the heart wants. And so sometimes it's, I just don't want to live this way anymore. Like, I feel like I'm in a straitjacket the entire time. I'm not free. I want to sleep with who I want to sleep with. I want to date this person even though they don't share my faith. I want to spend my money the way that I want to spend my money. And so there are heart issues where you feel like there's too much of a social cost being a Christian now. There's no social benefit. And so if there's a lot of social cost to being a Christian, like why am I doing this again? Like when people think I'm bigoted and I'm ignorant, I'm on the wrong side of history, like why do I want to associate myself with this historically regressive group? And so there's heart issues where like you want to be accepted and you want to live your life with autonomy and freedom the way that you want to. So Christianity can come across like a straitjacket. And so I would that's another reason why I think people are growing jaded with religion. And then obviously the hands. And with that, it's, I'm talking about abuse. And so sexual abuse in the church, spiritual abuse in the church. And so when something like that happens in your life, it literally changes the trajectory of your life. And so if it happens, especially under the church roof, it's very hard not to associate that with the faith, especially if it's coming from church leaders. And so the head, the heart, and the hands. And so what I would try to do is to do the best that I can to minister to those areas as best as possible so that they don't completely grow disenfranchised or deconstruct their faith.
Mm-hmm. And in that paradigm, right, the head, heart, and the hands, what are the ways in which our churches, specifically Asian American, Korean American churches, mm-hmm. what are the ways in which they've been structured that maybe has contributed to some of those problems? Mm-hmm. And then on the flip side, what are the ways in which you see, hey, maybe Korean American church culture can be a benefit to people who have had those experiences.
So I think one of the things that the churches that we may have grown up in, they didn't come across necessarily intellectually credible. So when they went to schools, their professors sounded intellectually credible, but when they went to church, the text was preached in such a way where it just didn't sound rational or logical at all. And so we've done a poor job of that. Additionally, the experiences that people have in church are not existentially satisfying at all. But when they're out in the real world, it's super satisfying. And so we need to provide communities where it's also like, I have friends, I have community, I find fulfillment. There's a person at my church recently got invited to Coachella, which is great, but it also happened to fall on Easter Sunday. He was a skeptic. And he was like, for some reason, I had no desire or feelings to go to Coachella. I actually wanted to come to church. And so there was something that was happening to him existentially that caused him to actually come to church on Sunday, despite being a skeptic. And so the two ways, and I'm biting this from Tim Keller, to really transform the heart is it intellectually credible? Is it existentially satisfying? We've done a poor job of that, and we need to do better. I do think that the Asian American church is certainly capable of that. We fellowship with the best of them. We're smart. We know the Bible. Like, why can't we do that? And we're able to. And so we need to provide churches and communities and forums where these kinds of spaces can happen more.
Right. And speaking of that, I think it's always interesting people use this term deconstructionism, but then nobody ever talks about constructionism.
Exactly.
Right?
Reconstructionism.
Yeah. What does it mean, or what maybe excites you right now about how churches, because like you said, a lot of these people, they grew up in church, and I think it's a critique of the way we constructed people's faith from when they were kids to now. How is that shifting for you, where you're like, hey, I think this is a better way in 2022 to construct people's faith that are entrusting either their children or like they're actually entrusting their own lives to the church?
Yeah, so what I would say is not all deconstructionism is bad. Some of it is good. So we should take a step back, and if we have the truth, we shouldn't be afraid to challenge our own truths, right? So question it. So one of the things that our church does is we have a venue called Curious. And so anyone can come, no question is off the table. So we provide spaces where we're not afraid to tackle the most difficult questions. And so that's what I mean when I say that not all deconstructionism is bad. Some of it is good. And so if we find answers for those doubts, it's actually a good thing. But I think far too often we've sort of seen doubt and questions as sort of like in a negative light instead of a positive light, which is the way that we should. And when you do that, you can help reconstruct their inherited faith to become their own when they're in their 20s and 30s and so on and so forth.
And that process, I think, when we make children's ministries and youth ministries, how does that mentality affect how we build those for you, like in your church and your context?
Yeah, I mean, the earlier the better, so if we don't get to our kids, the world will first. And so we need to start talking about even difficult things at an early age. And the Bible has so much to say about different topics. Yes, we have to do it in such a way where our kids can understand it, but we have to catechize and disciple our kids early because the world they're not going to wait. And so we need to start very early and give them the spiritual muscles to be able to handle the difficult questions that they're going to be asked and they're going to face. So I'll give you an example of this. So one of our pastors was at the playground, and his 3 boys were playing. And there were some other kids that were there, like 10, 11. They were watching porn on their phone at 10 or 11. When I was growing up, we didn't have that kind of access. The only access that we had to porn was at Blockbuster, but it was in that XXX room behind the curtain. You couldn't even get in there because you were a kid. But kids grow up so much earlier because they're exposed to so much. And so the world is not going to wait, and so we can't either. Yeah.
And then as you're constructing those things, how do you measure the difference between we're constructing this with intentional like biblical theology versus we're constructing this with kind of cultural warfare mentality, right? How do you
balance them both?
Measure, yeah.
So
how do you know which one's which?
So you do have to do a little bit of both. So I like what Jesus said when he said, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. So he's saying you have heard that it was said based upon culture. For us, it would be you have heard that it was said by this cultural prophet, rapper, athlete, poet, but I say to you. So we have to do the same thing. We can do it with biblical theology, certainly, but we also have to use cultural prophets as authoritative sources as well that can help critique culture in a biblical light. And so there's ways of doing that. So one of the things that we do at our church is obviously we preach the gospel, we preach the word, but we also use, cultural authorities, Elon Musk, Bezos, and other people to reinforce actually what the Bible is trying to teach. So there has to be a combination of both. Yeah.
And then how do you teach, as people are getting answers and they're learning these, they're challenging their doubts, at some point, faith is required to take that leap. Mm-hmm. How do you balance that? How do you encourage your congregants to, hey, ask questions and have these, but, like the knowledge gap, right? Every mm-hmm. answer is actually 2 more questions, right? How do you kind of help your congregants navigate that?
So that's a great question. So I think this is where preaching the gospel is not enough. There also has to be an invitation to actually believe in the gospel and to accept it. You can't just proclaim it. I now have to challenge you to accept it. And so one of the things that we actually do is we say, hey, where are you at? And I was asking this to one of the skeptics at our church, and he said, if baptism's a 10, I think I'm like an 8.5. And so he was measuring it that way. Because I continually, and recently he actually said, I was thinking about doing ministry this week. And I was like, how can you do ministry if you're not a Christian yet? And he was like, I don't know, I feel like I'm kind of there. And so it's one of those things that slowly crept up on him without him realizing. It's just kind of like when you're friends with someone, and then all of a sudden you develop feelings for them without even knowing it, and that platonic line was crossed at one moment. Like it wasn't planned, but it just kind of crept up, and that's what happened to him. But we have this culture where we just say, hey, where are you at spiritually? Because we're all on a spiritual journey, whether you're a skeptic or not, or religious. Like, where are you at? And so we constantly ask questions like that so that they can reflect on where they think they're at too. Yeah.
One thing that I have been noticing is that the head issues, mm-hmm. right? The apologetic kind of questions, they've sort of shifted in the last 20 years, right? They used to be a little bit more mm-hmm. What is truth? Mm-hmm. Red pill, blue pill, the mm-hmm. matrix, mm-hmm. right? But mm-hmm. now there's a lot more where fake news and people mm-hmm. being it doesn't matter what is true. Mm-hmm. So how have you and maybe your church, right, navigated what are the apologetic questions that are being asked now mm-hmm. versus the ones that maybe we grew up with when we were being saved?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Neil Postman, he once said that. So he made a contrast between George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's A Brave New World. And Postman said in 1984, if you want to control people or whatever, you limit the truth. And if you limit the truth, do some propaganda, they're not going to know what the truth is. And as a result, you can kind of control them, like North Korea. Huxley said, there's another way of doing it. Don't limit the truth, but give people so much information that finding the truth is like a needle in a haystack now. And with that, you can control people as well. And so that's the world that we live in now. There's so much information overload now. It's like, how do I know what's fake news versus real news? And we have difficulty, figuring out, how to discover the truth now. And so that's one of the things that's taking place here. So how do we communicate? How do we help them find that needle in the haystack? And I think you're right, the questions have changed. So in the past, it was what is truth? You're right. And now we live in a post-truth world. Or the questions back then were how do I know that the Bible is accurate? And those kinds of questions. People are not asking that now. And so the way to speak into people's hearts is by asking questions like, who do you think you are? Identity questions. That's a major question right now because we're not exactly sure who we are. We're still discovering who we are. But is identity something that you discover continually in a process, or is that something declared over your life? What is the meaning of life? Morality questions, destiny questions, what happens after we die, freedom questions. What is freedom? Questions about hope. Like those are the things that people are asking now, not Christianity versus other religions. Comparing it, like people are not interested in that anymore. So these are the kinds of things that we need to talk about. Yeah.
And you mentioned it about the kind of like being able to ask any question in those open forums. As we're transitioning, more and more into a digital space world, that old form where the pastor's on the pulpit and preaching and like you listen, versus now where more people are sitting in circles and being able to talk.
Yeah.
How do you approach trying to help people construct their faith when you as the pastor or even the elders don't have that level of control as you used to?
Yeah, so I think this is where we need to do some digital discipleship, where we teach our congregations what they consume and even how they consume it, right? So is it the best thing in the morning for your mental health? Do you look at social? Probably not. So there needs to be more digital discipleship that's done. So how do we consume it? What do we consume? There's so many resources out there. They're all saying different things. Everyone is on this giant spectrum. Even when we're in the same tribe, there's different parties. And so how do we figure out, and so there needs to be more teaching done on that, because to your point, they are being discipled and they are forming digital communities throughout the week, a lot more than 1 hour a week on Sundays. And so we had to do a lot more digital discipleship for that.
And when you talk about like the pain of the hands, right? With digital, the stories of church abuse and neglect and all of these things, they're so vast, they're so easy to find. How do you, both individually, right, like navigate all of those stories, but as well, how do you help your congregation to understand and have those things be a part of reconstructing instead of deconstructing their faith?
Yeah, so the last thing we want to do is shove those stories underneath the rug, because we've done that for far too long. And when that happens, there's more of an explosive reaction to it. And so we need to pull the rug out, and we need to talk about these stories, as painful and uncomfortable as those stories are. So we need to do a better job of telling these stories. And after we tell these stories to one another, and as difficult as they might be, we have to also learn how to understand how these kinds of stories got there to begin with. And more often than not, it's usually power dynamics behind abuse. There's a misunderstanding of power that's taking place. And when you think about what the gospel is, what is it? It's Jesus like washing our feet. It's a man dying naked on a cross. And so he subverts our understanding of power. And so there needs to be more teaching done on power as well, because that's where a lot of the abuse stems from, a misunderstanding of these kinds of dynamics. But the gospel is so subversive. And we need to establish now a culture in our church where we have a gospel understanding of power, where we serve one another. We didn't come to be served, So yeah, I think that's the way of going forward.
And being part of an Asian American leadership conference, I remember one thing in one of our past conferences was that there was a study in Ivy League schools of like people who are coming to Christ, right? That didn't grow up in church, were coming to Christ. And it was actually like 40% were Asian American. Like we're the fastest in America. We're the segment that's people are coming to the Lord and constructing their faith for the first time. Like from your perspective, and it could be a theory, right? Like what's your theory on maybe why that is? And why does that perhaps give us a little bit more, I don't know if relevance is the right word, in this discussion of deconstructionism and constructionism?
I haven't seen that study, and I don't want to make generalizations either. But I do think that so everyone has a worldview, and one of the ways of breaking down a worldview, I would say, is our origin. Where did we come from? What is the meaning of life? Morality, how do I live my life? And then like destiny, what happens after I die? And so every one of us has a worldview, whether you're Darwinian, secular materialist, Hindu, Muslim, or Christian, right? And I think one of the things that we have to figure out is what makes coherent sense? What best explains what's happening? And so one of the things I say to our skeptical friends is there are two things that you can do to help me deconstruct my own faith. because I was talking with a skeptic in our church, and I said to them, what would it take for you to believe in Jesus? And they turned the tables on me, and they were like, well, what would it take for you to not be a Christian? And I was like, that's such a great question. I said, there are probably two things that you can do to make me abandon my faith. Number one, find the missing body of Jesus. Like Ocean's 11, that thing, find it. I'm done, because his soul didn't rise from the dead, his body did too. So if you find the body somehow, I'm done. Like our faith falls apart. Second thing that you can do is tell me a better story. And to this day, I have not found a better story than Christianity. And so it sounds intellectually credible to me. And then secondly, it is existentially moving to me. I want this to be true. Like, why wouldn't I want eternal life? And so those two things, again, I think are one of the, it's hard to say for sure, but I think those two things are one of the reasons why.
Last question for you in your individual life and your life of your church and the ministry you're doing. What's your hope? Like, what's your excitement in this period of time where everyone is like, break it down, right? Like, what's your hope as a pastor that, hey, we're going to get through this and this is what is going to look like on the other side?
Yeah, so I think the question that people have been asking the past 2 years is, how do I lead my company, organization, church through a crisis? I think the question now, 2 years after 2020, is not how do I lead my company, church, or organization through a crisis, but it's how do I lead them out of a crisis? And that's exciting to me, because we want to help. The crisis that we've had the past 2 years is not the same now. So how do I lead our people out of this? It's a lot of mental health issues, a lot of existential angst, a lot of death, sickness, job loss. How do I lead our people out of this and into a brighter future? And I think it can be done, but the questions that we have to ask ourselves are a little bit different than they were just 2 years ago when we were just going through this crisis, trying to figure out how to use cameras and preaching to no one. And it's very different now, and that's exciting. It's a lot of work, but it's an exciting thing. I just prayed 2 minutes, so you kind of addressed it before when you said, questions that people are asking today are different than they were yesterday. And so I think one of the things that we have to do when we try to think about evangelism is, okay, then what does the cultural landscape look like today? And I'm a preacher, so there are 4 Ds that can help us understand the current cultural moment that we're in. I think the first thing is that we're more disenchanted than we've ever been before. We're very dystopian. So, and what I mean by that is we don't feel hope. So a pandemic, this is my second pandemic, by the way. I lived in China during SARS, so I can't handle another one. But we've gone through a pandemic. We have racial division. We have political strife. Our economy's collapsing. Gas prices are ridiculous. There's a war. And it's just how do you not feel disenchanted? And so that's what's happening. The second D is we're more distracted than ever before, too. So Microsoft did a study a few years ago, and they discovered that goldfish have an attention span of 9 seconds. And they also discovered that humans have an attention span of 8 seconds. So we now have an attention span lower than goldfish. And so imagine your attention span is like a glowing ball. Every 8 seconds, it's going from here to boom, here to boom, here, every 8 seconds. And so when you live this kind of distracted life, or Neil Postman also says we amuse ourselves to death, how are you going to think about the deep questions of life? What is the meaning of life? Why am I here? What happened? You're not going to think about that stuff. So we're distracted. So we're disenchanted, we're distracted. There's also more disunity. So we see it you see it on Twitter, you see it on social, and even within our own Christian family, there's a lot more division and disunity than there ever used to be. So that gets hard. And then the last thing I would say is, in the past, Christianity was always seen as dumb. And today, I think that narrative has shifted to not only dumb, but dangerous. And so now you have Christian nationalism. That was always present, but far more visible than it ever was before. Christians are always seen as bigots because we hate certain demographics. And so it's not only that I find your religion dumb, it's actually a threat to my life. It's dangerous. So why would I want to believe in that? And so one of the things that we had to do in our evangelism is, how do I re-enchant this person? How do I help this distracted person focus and descend that glowing ball into a deeper truth? How do I unify us rather than cause more disunity? And then how do I make Christianity seen as something that's more life-giving than dangerous to your life? It's actually the best thing for you. And so we have to do that in our evangelism. I think the primary way of doing that is by telling stories. I think suffering helps, but you can't make someone suffer. We have no control over that. But we can control stories. And so like Steve Jobs, he once went into the Apple cafeteria and he asked everyone, who's the most powerful person in the world? And like thinking it was a trick question, they were like, is it you? And he was like, no, it's not me. The most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. And so we need to tell stories, again, about identity. Who am I? What is the meaning of life? What does freedom really look like? What is hope? And these are the kinds of questions that can lift the spirit up in such a way where they're re-enchanted, more hopeful. They're not distracted because they find it quite appealing. And it's not dangerous or a threat to them, but it's really helpful. And so we have to do it from the pulpit. We have to do it at the cafe. We have to do it at work. We have to constantly be telling these stories to subvert the cultural landscape that we live in today.